Okay, so we're working on the eviction synthesis prompt. Very first takeaway that I need to make sure that we hear is that the argument is not about whether or not eviction exists, or even the multiple sides of eviction. The argument is about which are the most important factors to eviction. And like I said, this is the hardest type of prompt because it is more nuanced. The argument is hidden. There's not a clear pro and con. And so I want to point out some hacks or some tricks. If I get a prompt that says, what are the most important factors? I want you to think of four most important factors. And then what you're going to do, because you only need 3 body paragraphs, you're going to take away one of those 4 factors, and you're going to say, well, some people believe that, and then you're going to name the big idea above or containing that particular factor that you could have used for your side, but you're just going to move it and say, well, some people say that this most important factor should be considered in the housing crisis. In fact, we must consider blank, blank, and blank first because blank. Okay, so the hack is come up with 4 that you're thinking, 4 universal idea-based factors, right, that we should be talking about when we talk about the housing crisis. Now, it's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg. We could look through the sources and be pouring through the sources to find our 4 most important factors or our 4 idea-based claims. And in fact, logically, that's what we should do, right? We should read and then figure out our ideas based on the reading. I'm going to give you another hack because we only have limited time in the essay for you to go through all those sources. My hack is that you come up with your 4 idea-based claims or factors that are contributing or a part of the housing crisis that we must consider. So come up with 4 and think of those broadly like universal ideas, right? So some people are saying that, the most important factor to consider is that the housing crisis promotes a cycle of poverty, that children are negatively affected by the housing crisis. So these are things that are broad enough that my hunch is that most or some of those 6 sources are going to be talking about those if they're broad enough universal ideas to fit under that big topic of housing crisis. So try to get your 4 idea-based claims first, then go back to starting with 3 of the sources and even skim reading or surface level reading to see if you do find data, numbers, quotes that relate to those 4 idea-based factors that you're thinking of. That's probably the path that I would take. The risk that you run is that one of those or 2 of those 4 factors or ideas that you're thinking of are not necessarily readily visible in the sources. But remember, you can pull information from the sources and massage it or manipulate it to make it fit. So I was talking with Jay. Thank you, Jay, for this conversation. And he is thinking about one of the 4 most important factors we should consider with the housing crisis is that dependent children are negatively impacted. Perhaps he's going to say they're negatively impacted for life, right? That's making a strong idea-based claim. So we need to figure out, well, how can he support that claim using the 6, at least 3 of the 6 sources is what you're focusing on, right? You have to have at least 3 sources represented in your writing for this essay. So his risk is that he's going to go into the sources, and if he's just looking for the words dependent children, and if he's just looking for numbers and percentages, he may not find that. However, if he goes into the sources and he's looking for anything that can relate to the negative impact on children's lives forever. Thus, he's looking for anything he can pull that is a negative impact due to the housing crisis that he can then massage in his reasoning, in his talking and logic making, in his writing. He can attach those negative impacts that he pulled, those general negative impacts, and connect them to the negative impact on dependent children. He's going to have to make that work. And that's a decision that he would make in his writing because it is a timed essay, right? He likes this claim of idea, this idea-based claim that dependent children are, a bystander in this whole process, and they're negatively impacted for life, and they're passive and they can't do anything. So that's a great claim. If he doesn't want to mess around with that claim and spend a few minutes stressing over, okay, I need to change the claim because I'm not finding any of the any data or any quotes to support this claim in my sources, I would say to Jay, before you stress about renaming and reworking this claim, it's going to take a while to do that in a timed environment, I would try to pull general data or general quotes from those sources and then build in your reasoning and make the reasoning the connector about how they work together. This whole exercise with the 6 things is about you getting used to the cognitive steps, the actual steps that your brain needs to go through in a timed environment when structuring your essay. And so this particular assignment is crucial so that you can work through these questions and these problems and these, around the organization that we have now. So that's my lesson using Jay's slide. He did get this. He got it from another source outside of the 6. And so my pushback is you've got to just work with the 6 sources that they give you. That's all you're going to have in front of you. So if this was in one of the 6 sources, he would then just want to say, source B or A or C or D. And I want to go to this thesis, right? We know that we need to start a synthesis thesis with the counter argument or opposition using while or although, okay? And so we know that half of our thesis, or a little bit less than half, needs to be the counter. And then we rebut the counter with what we're proving in our thesis. So I'm going to read this. While one may say that evictions are creating more availability for housing, many families still struggle in order to find new housing that is affordable and being able to maintain new housing. Okay. But that doesn't directly address the prompt. And the prompt says, what are the most important factors in housing? All you have to do is just change the language in your thesis a little bit to then turn it back to the prompt that you are arguing for the most important factors. So then what's the counter position to the most important factors? The counter position is not necessarily that your most important factors are not important. The counter position is that there's another important factor, and that's, you're not considering that. Instead of this other important factor, which you agree exists, your factors are most important. So it's like all these things, these 4 things, okay, are factors that you are going to find in your reading or skim reading of the sources, or like my strategy to Jay, you're going to come up with the universal idea-based 4 factors on your own and then try to find the information in the sources to back them up. Okay, if they're broad enough, idea-based enough, chances are it's going to be in the sources. So you come up with your 4, okay? These should all be different colors. And then you're going to take one of them, all 4 could be important factors. You're going to take one and you're going to put it over here. And you're going to say, this is the counter argument. It's another factor, but we do not believe it is as urgent, immediate, and important as these 3. So while some may say that job loss is the most important factor when considering the housing crisis, in fact, blank, blank, and blank are more urgent in the housing crisis because blank. That's one way you structure your thesis. Or while some may say that job loss is the most important factor when considering the housing crisis, we must instead look at how people are affected within their own community and within their own blank first. Because, and then you're going to give a reason why. A thesis can be 2 sentences as well. One of the sentences needs to contain the counter argument. So again, I think that visual is so important. So come up with 4 things, 4 universal based ideas. These are going to be your factors, right? 4 impacts of the housing crisis, right? If they're broad enough and idea based enough, chances are they're going to be in 6 different sources about the housing crisis. Okay, you're going to come up with those 4. You're going to pull one aside, randomly even, and you're going to say, this does exist as a point, but in fact, these 3 are more urgent because blank. The other thing that we had talked about is that, to Nina's point from before in class and Yanelise's point, so I'm going to show you a thesis from someone else in our class, and they're working again on beginning the thesis with a counter argument, starting with while. Well, there are many who argue that everything in blue is like, you remember you have the 4 different facts or claims that you're working with. The blue one should be taken out of the 4, so it's still an important fact, but it's not as important as the ones you are going to name. So while there are many who argue that eviction would ensure the equal rights in society and its effects are the most important factors in the housing crisis. In fact, now this is what they're stating are the most important facts. I asked them to explicitly state universal ideas, right? Because that's how you're going to find, that's broad enough so that you can find evidence for these universal ideas in the text, in the sources. They say the inhumanity and struggle of the housing crisis must be considered before anything else. All right. So this is too long, right? Too much attention on the counter argument. So I asked them to think about, just as these are nouns, inhumanity, struggle, those are things, those are nouns. I'm asking them to find a noun or short noun phrase that is one other factor of the housing crisis, just not the one that they believe is important. And so I've asked for them to consider what they're trying to say. And they thought, they're thinking maybe it's the economics of the housing crisis, or see the noun phrase here, economics, and then the phrase of the housing crisis, or social class structure inherent in the housing crisis. That's a little long, but they need to come up with a noun phrase that, again, is a factor in the housing crisis. It's just not one of the factors that you believe is important. Notice, though, that they came up with this. These are not a list of 3 factors that they believe are most important. However, they're universal ideas that then you can go and you can say, look, these 3 things fit underneath inhumanity and struggle. So they're going to say less opportunity. That fits with inhumanity and struggle within the housing crisis. And within their paragraph, then, it actually buys them more room for analysis to stick with that broad universal idea in your thesis of inhumanity and struggle, right? Because now you get to tie in how less opportunity equals inhumanity. So with this one, they definitely have a connection between the increase of unemployment. I asked them, how does that relate to the 2 universal ideas in your overall thesis? They stated struggle and humanity. So they just need to make sure that they connect the dots in this overarching claim, this factor, connecting unemployment to the universal ideas of the whole essay, which is struggle and humanity. They did write this opposition slide, and again, they have to make sure that this idea of, I assume it's like less fortunate those who are less fortunate are more impacted by evictions. I'm just going to, those who are less fortunate are impacted by evictions. Again, this isn't a traditional counter, but it is, remember, you had your four. So if they had four of their factors, idea-based factors, one of them is going to move over here. That's going to be their opposition factor. And this, they decided something to do up here in their thesis. They are working on something to do with social class is the most important thing to consider in the housing crisis. So they took out, so social classes over here as their counter opposition. That means that here they have to have, and they do, those who are less fortunate, right? That goes with their thesis, with their counter in their thesis, are more impacted by evictions. So they would begin with an opposition statement, although those who are less fortunate are impacted by the housing crisis. Now you're going to say something about your side. You're going to say something about one of these three, all right? So less fortunate, we have our social infrastructure is all about the opposition, and then we're dealing with our 3 points that have to deal with the inhumanity and struggle, and we are deciding that that is less opportunity for people. We're deciding here that it's an increase of unemployment rates, and we're deciding here that it is the health risks during a pandemic and the negative impacts in conjunction with the housing crisis. So that's kind of where this argument is headed. I did want to point out they are already starting to work through what the opposition counter-argument language can be. Again, one way to do it, begin with an although, begin with your opposition statement or what the opposition believes, and then introduce your factor. Again, it's not totally your side, but your side would be one of these 3 factors. And then they moved on and they said, source C brilliantly points out how, right? We can infer that that's something they found from source C that backs up one of their 3, right? And they paraphrase, they put it into their own words. Great. Likewise, source A, so they're going to find something else from another source that supports one of their 3. And then they might double back and then say, conversely, the opposing point view argues blank in direct contrast to source A's belief that blank. So then they're weaving in, okay, conversely, this guy over here, remember our point about the less fortunate? Well, we found a source, maybe it's source E that supports that, all right? And they're arguing, you're going to say what they argue, but that is in direct contrast to source A that supports our belief. However, or ultimately, why is your position, which is one of these 3 factors, why is that the most important? So you're beginning to weave a conversation that you're having, always knowing that your position is in the back of your mind, right? Your position would be these 3 are the most important, whereas this one is not as important. That's it. That's your position. And the counter is always this guy over here who is not as important. I know it's strange because it's not a typical argument, but I hope you can see kind of where we're going. This would be a body paragraph in your essay right here, the way that they've kind of structured it out. Takeaways, you got to go back to your thesis. You got to clean it up and point to what the prompt is actually asking you to do, which is yours versus this one. The way you get to this one is to come up with 4 universal ideas related to the topic, housing crisis and eviction. Pull out one, okay? Now you're going to think like this guy is the one that is not as important. These 3 are more important. So we're advocating for these 3. And all the time we're saying why this one is not as important to the discussion right now, okay? I hope that this helped. Let's continue to work through it and bring me your questions. Thank you.